One of the things that makes trafficking, sex trafficking, so complicated is that there is this narrative that all these women have been kidnapped and forced across borders and that they have been exploited in this way, that they're underground, right? That narrative is what allows for a whole cottage industry around of nonprofit organizations to exist around this topic. I'm going to say this, like, I'm not saying that it doesn't exist, but I'm saying that it doesn't exist at the numbers that those nonprofit organizations claim at the time. And so there's a narrative, there's like a popular narrative, and then there's a reality on the ground. And the narrative that was constructed primarily outside of Vietnam, like in the United States mostly, and by anti-trafficking organizations, was one that was easy to believe, right? It's like poor third world women victims. And by the way, it's over there in this country, over there, you can't find them. And I think there's something very racist about those kinds of narratives because they were constructed off of very, very little to almost no data. And when I started to circuit nonprofit organizations claiming to work on these causes, most all of them were working on issues to prevent human trafficking because they themselves could not identify victims of trafficking either. So it was years of just like going to organization after organization and being like, why are they so coy about who they're working with, about like their victims? And they would say, oh, we're protecting them. We're protecting. That wasn't the case. I mean, if you look at Somali Mom in Cambodia, that's a huge example of just the fraud around this sex. I mean, Nicholas Kristoff and Cheryl Wu Dunn, like all the way up to all these celebrities, right? And you have to ask yourself why. And, but at the same time, I will say that some of the work that those organizations were doing wasn't bad. I mean, many of those organizations were working with women who are victims of domestic violence, but it's easier and sexier to raise money around sex trafficking than it is to say, I'm raising money to help women who are victims of domestic violence, right? Like, or help women escape factories, or labor trafficking. Like labor trafficking was one where there were lots of victims of labor trafficking, yet nobody could seem to raise any money to work on those causes. And so I think that where I came in, it was like I didn't have a lot of friends, right? The feminists didn't want to hear my arguments that women had agency in the sex industry, and all the sex trafficking advocates and heroes didn't want to hear the narrative that these women have agency either, right? Like, and I'm like, look, all of these things can coexist in the same world, but like as an academic, my job is to collect data and report what I find. And if what I'm finding is very different from the narrative that's out there, I have an obligation to report that and actually like to respect the women that I study, to share their narratives and report as they share with me. The last thing I will say about this is that that whole thing of like, there's no way you can find out until you go in. Well, I did go in. Like I went in and worked in 4 different bars for 15 hours a day for nearly 15 months, because I thought, like, I was convinced, okay, I'm never going to see this from the outside. And many academics, women, nonprofit organization workers would say the same thing. Oh, you can't see it because you're on the outside. So then I decided, like, okay, let me get in on the inside and see. And what's ironic about this, and I never put these two together until years later, but what I saw, and I think that the reason why I was able to see the humanity in those spaces and to see the women for how they wanted to be seen is because I worked in this pool hall with my parents, because I didn't come to the field as a snobby elite academic, because I was a working class girl out of her, like a fish, out of water in academia, that I related far more to the women in these bars as people who I grew up with than I did to other academics who were in Vietnam with me at the time, or other academics in the US who like have a certain kind of elitism and arrogance to them. So I really think that there was something about my own subject position and my own who I was and what I was bringing to the table that brought that out, that allowed me to see a lot of that, right? Like it's interesting because if you think about like people who run these nonprofit organizations, and it's not a ding against them really, but it's like they come from elite backgrounds. They were educated at some of the best schools, and they pride themselves on that. So there's a huge gulf, of like where their lives are versus the lives of the people that they're rescuing. And I feel like certainly there was a huge gulf for my life, and I definitely occupy a position of privilege now more than ever. And I certainly did occupy a position of privilege at that time too. But that gap was, I think, smaller because of sort of like this working class background that I grew up in. And I will say that one bar where I worked, the owner of that bar knew my parents because he had frequented my parents' billiard. And so there are these ties, right? Like across transnational boundaries. And I think that like the kinds of people that understand that billiard scene are the same kinds of people that are going to show up in the bars that I was in, right? And so maybe there, and I'm saying this like maybe with a big maybe, there's victims of trafficking in other places. I will say this, that like a lot of those organizations who were trying to identify victims of trafficking in the city, like in Saigon and Hanoi, couldn't find them there, so they went to the village. Couldn't find them there, so they went to the border of Vietnam and China. I mean, couldn't find them there, so it's just like, went to other places. And so like the way that that whole narrative works and functions is if you identify it in more remote, far away places that nobody else can get to. But the reality of it is like it's actually very hard to kidnap somebody and force them to engage in this kind of work against their will. Am I saying that sex work is not exploitive and that is not constrained within institutions of patriarchy? Absolutely not, right? It is. But that's very different from saying like, oh my gosh, we need to rescue these women. Because rescuing these women comes with huge consequences for their lives. What that often means actually is that there are police raids on places that are legitimate businesses. And in fact, what I will say, this is related to the Atlanta shootings. I just wrote, I don't know if you've read, but I wrote this piece in Vox, but many of those businesses operate as legitimate massage parlors, but because of this whole human trafficking narrative, a lot of those immigrant businesses have become scrutinized by law enforcement, I think unfairly, right? And so we can stereotype them as, illegitimate businesses where illegal things happen, where sex is being traded. But actually, if you look at the age of those women that we've now uncovered, and if that's a stereotype, that's a very racist stereotype, one that has been perpetuated by trafficking organizations and advocates who have a role in shifting the narrative that way, so that now law enforcement is going there to try to identify victims of trafficking, right? Like, and again, that's not to say that it doesn't exist there at all, 100%, but not on the scale and in the ways that it's been so grossly exaggerated.